It's August 2001. High above the pitch-black Atlantic Ocean, Air Transat Flight 236 is quietly cruising at 34,000 feet. Suddenly, the right engine sputters and dies. Exactly 13 minutes later, the left engine stalls. The low hum of the cabin drops into dead silence, and the main lights flicker out. In an instant, this 200-ton aircraft has been reduced to a powerless glider. Up to this point in commercial aviation history, no pilot has ever faced this exact scenario. There is no emergency checklist for it, and absolutely no training manual. The immediate question for the crew, and investigators later, is how a modern jetliner could silently bleed out nearly 47 metric tons of jet fuel into the ocean without triggering a single direct alarm. To understand how the longest passenger glide in aviation history happened, we have to reverse engineer the crisis, tracing it back to a single microscopic flaw. 9 days prior, a maintenance crew in Toronto is under intense pressure. They are facing a strict Sunday deadline to swap out a malfunctioning right engine on this exact plane. Without a direct spare available, the airline borrows an older Rolls-Royce engine. It looks identical from the outside, but internally, the plane's newer hydraulic pump doesn't fit properly against the old fuel lines. This diagram illustrates the problem. The correct installation instructions are sitting nearby on an offline CD, but nobody checks it. A technician improvises, installing an older hydraulic tube against a newer fuel tube in a cramped fit. In flight, engine vibrations cause the incompatible tubes to grind. Over several flights, friction cars an L-shaped crack, draining jet fuel at 13 tons per hour, and the pilots have no idea. Airbus had not installed an automated fuel leak warning system on this model, despite receiving official recommendations to do so after a nearly identical incident 4 years earlier. A rushed physical shortcut combined with ignored safety warnings meant that the aircraft took off with a structural failure already in progress, invisible to the crew as they headed out over the dark ocean. We jump back to the cockpit at 5:33 a.m. The pilots finally get their first sign of trouble. But it isn't a leak alarm. It's just a vague advisory message indicating a fuel imbalance between the left and right wings. Standard safety protocol requires pilots to pull out a physical checklist to hunt for a potential leak. Instead, the crew decides to troubleshoot the issue from memory. The crossfeed valve normally acts as a solid barrier between fuel tanks. Troubleshooting from memory, the pilots open it, missing crucial leak warnings. Consequently, fuel from the healthy left wing rapidly drains across the open barrier, flowing straight out the cracked right pipe. The crew's reliance on memory over protocol actively doubled the crisis by feeding the remaining fuel directly into the leak, guaranteeing that both of the jet engines would eventually starve. Which brings us back to the moment the second engine dies. The massive aircraft has lost all primary electrical power, and the 306 people on board begin falling toward the ocean. In a last-ditch effort, an emergency system deploys. A ram air turbine, or RAT, drops from the belly of the plane. This small mechanical windmill spins in the rushing air, generating just enough power to keep basic flight instruments alive. Using those instruments, the pilots locate a remote military airbase in the Azores, but reaching it means they have to stretch a powerless glide over 144 kilometers of open ocean. For the next 19 harrowing minutes, the heavy aircraft coasts steadily downward, completing the longest powerless descent in commercial aviation history. The landing is violent. Without engine power, they have no reverse thrust to slow down. The plane slams onto the runway, blowing its tires and sparking fires along the tarmac. But the extreme braking works. Every single person on board survives. The man who commanded this impossible flight was Captain Robert Pichet. As the media dug into his background, they discovered that decades earlier, Pichet had spent time in prison for drug smuggling. Pichet's experience as a bush pilot had involved landing in small clearings without conventional runways. Faced with too much altitude on final approach, he performed a series of aggressive 360-degree turns and side slips, extreme maneuvers typically avoided in commercial jets, to burn off height without engines. It was this specific familiarity with unorthodox flight that allowed him to align the plane with the runway. While catastrophic flight disasters are almost always the result of a quiet chain of compounding, mundane errors, Breaking that chain sometimes relies on a human pilot whose specific, unconventional history happens to match the exact demands of an impossible situation.